All right, so just to remind ourselves what we're doing, we're looking, we have understood that transfer is more complicated than just saying, if it's different from my L1, it'll be more difficult for me in my L2, right? We don't know that that's true. And in fact, on one of the first parts of how languages might be utilized, we know that sometimes when things are similar, the L1 learner distrusts, the L2 learner distrusts that similarity. And so it's nothing so straightforward as that. So we're looking at the more complicated ways in which that might happen. And really these are from, all these more complicated ways are based on the research in SLA. So they're not sort of somebody's kind of idea of what might be happening, right? They're all documented strategies that are in your book, and they give you lots of examples of them in your book, which I'm not going to go through one by one. First one is avoidance of structures. Second one is differential learning rates based on similarity between L1 and L2, or based on this possibility of a natural order hypothesis, where if you go in the right direction in the right scheme, then you'll get it better. Another one is different paths based on the L1, so you'll end up in the same place, but the way that you get there might be different depending upon what you're taking in from your first language, and particularly this transfer to somewhere principle that you saw demonstrated in your Norwegian little boy. And then another thing is overproduction, and overproduction often goes with avoidance, right? So learners will overproduce a structure that they feel comfortable with in order to avoid a structure that they don't feel comfortable with, right? Just because they're overproducing it doesn't mean necessarily they're getting it right. It just means that they're comfortable with it, right? So they would rather use that than they would. These are all the kinds of reasons why you want to do some data analysis with your learners, because you can identify what learners are using, helps you identify learners using different strategies. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is under what conditions is transfer likely to apply? So again, we know that there are transfer errors. We absolutely know that, but we also know that they're not the be all and end all of why we have different errors. But if we are going to have transfer, and it might be more learner dependent than we think, meaning each learner sort of makes their own choices, what conditions is transfer likely to come from? So first of all is this transfer to somewhere principle. What looks likely in the mind of the learner, essentially? The learner says, that looks like a possibility, I'll try that. Okay, so that might be, for example, your Norwegian boy saying climb you, right? He's like, could be, looks like a reasonable possibility, sticks it in there, and that's the transfer to somewhere principle. Okay, in his mind it looks likely. Another one is if there's a distinct difference. Okay, so for example, it clearly doesn't exist in the L1, this thing that they're talking about, thus only new rules need to be learned. Okay, so for example, think of the article system, right? The Chinese learner says, okay, I haven't got an article system, so I'm not gonna, my prediction is that I'm not going to use that. I'm actually going to learn the rules in the new L1, okay? Excuse me, in the new L2. But what and so they try and simplify that, right? They say, well, there's this article system, which we don't have, but how bad can it be, right? So, but we know that learners have hideous problems with the article system. Why? Because the article system in English is not based in syntax, it's based in pragmatics, meaning the choice of the article that you use is usually often based on what it is you think the person you're talking to knows, okay? So if I say, for example, this is the example I always use, I think it's sort of fairly straightforward. If Mark is coming to visit our house, and he says to me, oh, can't quite remember what happens after I get off the 30, and I say, oh, you remember you turn left onto the 69, you'll go under the bridge and then come around the corner. And he's like, oh yeah, right, yeah, I got it, right? But if he's never been to my house before, I'm gonna say, and he says, I get it up until the I-30, and then what do? And I say, you'll go off onto the 69, you'll go under a bridge. Okay, so instead of saying the bridge, I say a bridge. And the reason I make that choice is because in the first one, I know that he's familiar on some level with the bridge because he's gone under that bridge before. And in the second one, I know that he's never come to my house before, and so he's not familiar with the bridge. Now, I make that choice as a native speaker just like that, right? Based on my understanding of what I know about Mark's knowledge, right? So this is why learners have such a problem with the article system, because it is primarily based in pragmatic knowledge, meaning the context, the moment, right? So when you try and teach it to learners through purely syntax, there's all kinds of problems, and it's the reason why it's so complicated. So the distinct difference, meaning something appears in the L2 and there's nothing in the L1, is usually good predictively, because it means that there's nothing to confuse them, but only if it's not pragmatically complex. If it's pragmatically complex, then it's not necessarily super helpful to have something brand new. And the last one is this idea of perceptual salience or frequency effects. So it's so common, it's said so much, that it becomes a stable part of the interlanguage. So think about something that you might say, okay, I want you to try and think back, Shihan, to some of the first phrases or things that you might have learned when you came to the US. Something that was so common that you just repeated it.
Some phrases that I have never heard like in a year.
Right. But that became a fairly stable part of your language because you heard it every single day. Something like, how you doing?
What's up? And answering not much.
Good. Perfect. So Shihan's is what's up? And the answer is not much, which in Korea you would have been like, what? Right? Because it makes no sense whatsoever. Indeed. And Diego, you have one?
I was just going to say, okay.
Okay.
It's not okay, but it's you use it all the time to your friends. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So these become what we call the frequency effects, the perceptual salience. So perceptually, that's very salient, because every time someone comes up to you, they say, what's up? And you want to do something, right? You don't want to ignore the person and walk on. So perceptually, it's very salient. You know, you need to know what to say. And it's also very stable. They're going to say the exact same thing to you every day. What's up? Not much, you know. So that's what we call a highly perceptually salient frequent input. And it could be also the other way around. Something that is so rare that you hardly ever say, and only in very specific contexts. And it's so sort of weirdly contextual that you remember it really well, because there's no other environment in which you might hear this thing or say this thing. Now, my example I always used to use, but we can't really use it anymore, is when you go to a grocery store, when you used to go to a grocery store, and they would say at the end of it all, paper or plastic. And second language learners, this is never in a textbook.
No.
Do you know what I mean? Paper or plastic?
Paper bag or plastic bag?
Yes, but this is never in an EFL book, right? You know, you have lots of things that say, you know, you're in a store, go and buy some bread. You know, can I have some bread? Yes, please. You know, $1.99, right? But they never say paper or plastic at the end. So learners would come here back in the day. Now you're not really given the option for paper bags, right? I mean, maybe in Brookshire's and some of that, but I mean, now you have to ask, is my understanding, for a paper bag. They'll just give you a plastic, like Walmart, they'll just give you a plastic bag. But back in the day, they used to give you the option. This is the only context in which a person would say to you, paper or plastic, like really fast. And you have to know it just because you understand in the store that you're getting this choice, okay? So that would be the opposite. That would be, it's so rare that it's remembered. Also because it takes you completely by surprise. You have no idea what this person is saying to you. So I always feel terrible, used to feel terrible, because the person in front of me, the second language speaker in front of me would be like, I'm sorry, what? And the person would say, paper or plastic? And they'd be like, you know, what? And they just had no idea. You know, their credit card was out or their money was out. They were ready to finish. They had no idea what they were now being asked for. Yeah, so so it could be either end of those things. Notice that even though that's rare, that is perceptually salient, right? Because you're now stuck in a store in front of God knows how many people, and you're being seriously embarrassed, right? Because you can't understand what's being said. So that's perceptually salient. I don't know if anyone can think of any examples that now still happen, because paper and plastic just doesn't happen.
Cash or card?
Cash or card, yeah, I guess, but that's probably in a book, in a textbook, cash or card. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah. Anyway, so it's something like that. Mm-hmm. And these things may be something that we call markedness. Now, we're going to come back to markedness and unmarkedness in, I think, the next chapter on formal approaches. But basically, the idea of markedness is something, if something is marked in the in language, it is uncommon. No, wait. Yes, uncommon. If something is unmarked, it is common. Yeah, right. Now it's like, what? So it's the opposite. So something that is unmarked would be something like SVO, order, word order, subject, verb, object. That is an unmarked word order structure, right? It appears one of the most appearing word orders in, whereas, for example, Yoda, happy I am, right? Is that what he says? Or happy am I? Happy I am, right? So it's object, subject, verb, right? Or bad he is, right? About Darth Vader, right? So bad he is, it would be object, subject, verb. that would be a very marked word order structure because it is not in many languages in the world. One of the reasons they chose it for Yoda, in fact. So marked means uncommon, so that's Yoda, and unmarked means common, so that's SVO, right? So what many people say, and you'll read about this in your next chapter too, is that if something going from one language to another language is more marked in terms of the world's languages, then it will be more difficult for the learner. So if we think about it in terms of phonology, for example, English has an extremely marked consonant in its consonant inventory. Can anyone think of what that one is? A rare consonant, an extremely marked consonant that learners have a lot of trouble with. Good, the theta. Good, yeah. This is an extremely marked sound in the world's languages, right? There are not that many, and it's partly because you have to move your tongue over your teeth and everything else. So what we expect is that a marked sound like a theta is going to be more difficult for a learner than an unmarked sound. What's an unmarked sound? Well, all the languages in the world have a high vowel, an E, or a version of an E, a low vowel, version of an R, and another high back vowel, a version of a U or a O. All languages have those. So some version of that we expect our learners. Now, our learners have trouble with the tense and lax, right? The E versus I. That's more marked in terms of, so the idea is that if you move from an unmarked language that has maybe only 4 vowels or 3 vowels to a marked language like English, or God help you, French, that has nasal vowels as well as oral vowels, then this is going to be more tricky, right? That was always taken for granted, but now what they suggest in this chapter, once you've done your reading, is that it may be that perceptual salience is beats out, trumps out markedness. So even if it's an extremely marked structure in the world's languages, as long as the input is consistent in the second language, it's frequent and it's perceptually salient, it doesn't matter that it's marked. Okay. Now I hope you can see how we're building layers of complexity, right? Because you might say, well, this should be difficult because this is marked. Okay, this is something that's not in their first language. It's also marked in the world's languages. So then you do your experiment and wait, they're all really good at it. So you're like, huh, why are they all really good at it? So then you have to look at these other possibilities, like, for example, perceptual salience or frequency. They might be really good at it because it's something that's highly perceptually salient because it's highly frequent. So you want to be thinking about all these different factors. Okay, another one is cognitive likelihood. And this is basically features that learners think are language neutral. Okay, in other words, they think every language has to do this, right? Because this is something that you want to do. So all languages must do this. Okay. One example is contrastive stress. So if we take something like, it's not the red umbrella, it's the blue umbrella, right? It's not the red umbrella, it's the blue umbrella. What's my message? What am I trying to say?
emphasizing the information that is new to the listener.
Good, you've got the wrong umbrella, right? I'm emphasizing the information that's important, which is, I don't want that red umbrella, I want that blue umbrella. We're all assuming I understand I want an umbrella, right? Most people in English that speak English natively think that this has to be a language neutral item. Like if you're going to try and say that, you would have to do it by stress. But in fact, it isn't at all. If you look at different varieties of even English, you find that there's something called heavy end stress, which means when you have a statement like that, it comes out not the red umbrella, the blue umbrella. Not the red umbrella, the blue umbrella. And that's because of what we call heavy end stress, which means the stress moves all the way to the end of the phrase. So the contrastive stress that's supposed to be the point of the whole exercise disappears, okay? And so it is not a language neutral item, in fact. There are many different ways to do contrast. So how would you do it if you didn't do it using stress? Well, some language, they use a marker. So they say, this is the new information. So not the red umbrella, the blue umbrella, some kind of marker that says it's that umbrella, the blue one, you know, and that's a morphological marker, has absolutely nothing to do with stress. Just making some kind of sense. So learners have very interesting things that they think must be true, right? And in your second data analysis, you're going to have a look at some of the things that learners think must be true. So this is known as psychotypology, which is the perception, learners' perception of what should be happening rather than the reality, okay, based on their understanding of the world. And typology means what?
Landscape?
Huh?
Surface?
Not surface. In this case, typology of languages. Yeah, all the different kinds of typology is the study of all the different kinds of languages. So a typological approach to language analysis would take as many languages as you could find and try and find out what's in common with each of the languages. This is completely different from the kind of analysis that Chomsky did, because what did he say? Remember what we said back in week 2?
But he did a universal.
Right. He did a universal, but he didn't do it based on typology. He sat in the basement in MIT and he said, however I'm organizing it, as long as I can get the language architecture abstract enough, because my language is grammatical, this has to apply to every other language. So it's a completely different way of trying to work out what's happening in here, right? For some people, it's like when you look at all the languages you can find. Typologists are the people that are super upset that we're losing languages by the 100, basically, because as you lose native languages or smaller languages, you might lose a typological step in the ladder, right, to understand how we got from one thing to another thing. Whereas if you believe that all you need is your own native grammar to work out what's happening in the abstract, then you don't need to be a typologist. But psychotypology basically means, based on my idea of the world and how language should work, I believe that this should happen or that should happen. All right. This one, this idea of coreness, again, this is something that's going to come up with your second data analysis. So just a sort of FYI hint. again, it's the notion of transparency. So coreness means what seems to be the most concrete, most literal way that this can be interpreted, right? Coreness says, if I have a language feature, like for example, a tense, then what's the most literal way in which this tense can be interpreted, right? So this is the problem with English, for example, with a habitual present, right? So beginning learners will say, I am playing tennis every day. Because that makes, can you see as a core meaning that makes more sense, right? Every day I am playing this. So I continuously play tennis. So it seems like when we have something called a continuous tense, right, you should use that, right? They just learned that there's a continuous tense, so they say, great, I am playing tennis every day. And their teacher says, but no, in fact, it's I play tennis every day. Because even though it goes on, it's a habit, right? And we have what's called a habitual present. So there's no ing attached to it. So in that sense, coreness is violated, all right, in that particular sense, because you think, you know, now non-native varieties, well, not non-native, but new varieties, often resolve this lack of coreness by changing the grammar. So in Indian English, they will say, I am having a headache, which means as I stand here looking at you, this headache is happening to me, right? Rather than I have a headache, right? And we've picked that up a little bit. In the McDonald's ad, we say, I'm loving it, instead of I love it, which is what it should be in American English. But so coreness has to do with, look at how the world works. Surely the language should work this way as well, right? So let's have a look at page, the figure on page 152, just to give you another idea. This is what learners are most likely to transfer, right? So if it's close to their first language and a core meaning, they're most likely to transfer it, okay? If they're close to their language and it's non-core, they may well transfer it. But if it's distant from their first language and also non-core, they're not going to transfer it. Can someone explain that to me in another way so that I can see that you understand it? Give it a go.
I understand it, but it's hard to explain.
It's hard to explain, but I want someone to have a crack at it. It's not a test. I just want someone to have a crack at it. Okay, so coreness means that it reflects the way the world works, right? It makes sense to you. The way the grammar is organized reflects the semantic reality of the world. Does that make sense? Okay, so as I said, if you're doing something over and over again, it would seem that the core meaning should be ing, right? Because it's continuous. So if it's close to your first language and the syntactic reality reflects the semantic reality, you're much more likely to transfer it, okay? If it's far away from your first language And in addition to being far away, it seems semantically very weird, like a very weird way to syntactically express something, then you're much less likely to transfer it. Yeah?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
When I was teaching English in Mexico,
Yes.
I had one student who was having a real hard time with the English distinction between second person and third person in pronouns.
Okay.
Because in Spanish, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'll put you on the spot, but my Spanish is wretched, so. But I think that su can mean yours, as well as his, hers, or its.
Right.
Okay. She couldn't understand that in English, we didn't have a single word that was equivalent for su. But so, well, if it's second person, it's yours. And if it's third person, it's his, hers, or its, depending on whether it's a he, she, or an it.
Right.
She just had this concept of, if it's mine, it's me. If it belongs to
anybody else in the whole
outside of
world.
me,
Yeah.
it's su.
Good.
So she, and actually the rest of the class got annoyed with her because they all understood what she did. I spent about
Oh.
15 minutes working with her, and finally I was just like, okay, we gotta move on.
You got it. Yeah. Gotta let that one go. Huh?
Right,
Yeah.
I'll visit with
So
you.
that is a classic psychotypology. Like in her world, it's either mine or somebody out there, right? But the fact that it could be mine or she, hers, but then I've got to make another difference for it to be neither mine or she, hers, but to be one of you three, a third pronoun, then, and remember that the you, the reason this is so hard is the you is based on my relationship to this person, right? So if I say you, I have to point to somebody, right? And I have to say it's you, right? Or it has to be clear from the context that it's you, right? So her psychotopology says, wait, why isn't you like, are y'all? Right? So that's perfect. That's a perfect example. Now, in this case, it's true that it's distant and she might perceive it as non-core, meaning literally, what are you trying to tell me? Like, because literally the world is me and are y'all, right? So it's non-core for me to imagine. Now, this also happens in a lot of smaller languages too. There's a word for me and a word for everybody else, or there's a word for you two and then everybody else, but there's not like 5. There's like me and she, her, and then everybody, so that's an absolute great example of psychotypology and core and non-core, close and distant. Yeah. Did she ever work it out?
No, I don't think so.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't feel bad because all the other students were annoyed, so I was like, okay, this is not on me. This you're all getting it. It's just this one person.
Oh, that's kind of mean. Well, clearly you suck. Not my fault. Yeah, we're not supposed to do that to our students, but yeah, fair enough. No, there does come a point where you're like, oh, but
I had to stop because everybody was getting mad at me because they were like, look, just
let it go. Yeah, she's never going to get it. And it's interesting because that is exactly this idea of psychotypology. Like in her own mind, she can't make that distinction, so it has to do with what's happening in here, like trying to reorganize the world. Yeah. Did you have a question, Tony? No. Okay. All right. So coreness is this idea of transparency. Now, transparency might be what you and I assume to be transparent, or it might be what's transparent in the world, right? So what makes sense in my worldview, okay? Think about it in terms of things like, we use the phrasal verb, the difference between come in and let down, right? In terms of come in, it's transparent, the verb and the preposition. In terms of let down, it's not transparent. It's kind of a metaphorical let and a metaphorical down. So the more metaphorical you get, the more non-core it gets. And the more metaphorical and non-core and distant it is, like if you've got a language that doesn't even have phrasal verbs, then you're in even more trouble. Okay? Make sense? All right. So, and finally, they talk about processing. And this is very similar to this idea of core and non-core. Like, you begin with either a universal processing strategy or a processing strategy based on your L1. So a universal processing strategy might be what we called last week. Who remembers what the name of this thing was when I talked about what a first language child does? If I say, what's this? Who remembers what the name of that principle?
I can't remember the name.
I'm glad that you remember, though. I should have brought the hedgehog. It's the hedgehog is the one that fixes it. Huh?
There's a hedgehog?
No, I should have brought the hedgehog. Normally I bring a hedgehog for that example. Not a live hedgehog, a dead hedgehog. I mean a toy hedgehog. I'll try and remember to bring. So this was called the whole object principle, right? Quine's whole object. Like if you say, what is this? Children don't say a blue label or water. They say a bottle. They assume if I say this is so that the whole wug, right? If you say this is a wug, they assume you mean this whole thing. They don't assume you mean one little part of it, right? So that would be what we would call a universal kind of processing strategy. This is how, as human beings, we're built, you know, to recognize the world. Or it could be one based on your L1. So, for example, a really a nice one for that is the idea of contrastive stress. Like contrastive stress, this idea of it's a red umbrella, not a blue one, is so innate in English speakers. Is, as I say, is part of the intonation that is potentially developed in utero. It's so innate that it's a processing strategy that we use, right? But it's in fact based on our L1 because there are other languages where contrastive stress doesn't happen. So there you can think of perceptual salience, right? For example, if you have a sentence that has a tense marker and that you think is a past tense, and a time adverb, then what are you more likely to, if you're a learner of English? So let me give you an example. So today, John smoked a cigarette, right? Now, smoked is a past tense marker, right? Today is a present tense marker, right? So the idea is, which one as a learner, if you're not sure what the meaning of that is, does that mean he is smoking today or that he did smoke? Do you see what I mean? That's not a great example, actually. It would have to be an example that it could be either have to be like a past tense, but a current time marker. I can't think of a good example. I'll have to try and think of one. But basically, the idea is that if you've got a time marker, a time adverb, like now, today, yesterday, and you've got a tense marker, that doesn't necessarily match the time marker, what do you think learners are going to go for?
Probably going to go for the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely correct. And I want you to remember this discussion for your second data analysis.
Is it simpler because it can't be mistaken?
Because it's super what? Begins with T. Transparent. Yay! My work here is done. Brilliant. My work here is done. Yes, it's super transparent, right? If you're a learner, you're looking for the most transparent thing. And a time marker, an adverb that actually says to you now, is way more transparent than a tense marker that you may or may not be able to work out, right? So yes, given the choice, learners will tend to go for the more transparent, which is the time marker.
Is that the same with language 1 learners?
Is that the same?
With language 1 learners?
Oh, with L1 children? Yeah. Yeah. A transparency is absolutely, and when we talk about transparency, we're really talking about how does the world work? You know,
I would think it's the opposite because the verb is usually the most important part.
right, but it's an indicator of the semantics, right? It's an indicator of the semantics, not of that. What you're looking for is something semantically transparent. Okay. Now the verb is important to work out what someone's doing or not doing, but what's the most transparent semantic thing in that sentence? The most, if you didn't know the verb and somebody said, what's the timeline here? You would go for the adverb marker because it's the most transparent thing. Yep. Yep. And so that's what we would call a universal sort of processing strategy. And this is the reason why many people disagree with this idea of a language acquisition device, a special device, because they think that a lot of a language can be explained just by looking at the world. You know, children come into the world and they have to interact. Babies have to interact with the world. They have to learn to understand space. They have to learn to understand movement. And that a lot of people believe that this is in fact how they learn language. They connect the language with what's happening in the real world. And transparency is super important for that, right? So the more transparent something is, the more it connects to the real world, the more likely learners are to go for it. That's a universal strategy. All right. So I think that's, yeah. So how my L1 transfer manifest, okay, which was our original question. So one might be a learner's psychotypology, right? Like how they view the world. So this could be different between one learner and another learner. This is why you might have completely different examples of some forms of transfer between two learners from exactly the same language, right? Because their psychotypology might be different. And in fact, Mark had an example of that with his learner, whose psychotypology was really like cray-cray if she couldn't work out the, yeah. Then another one is the perception of the native language to target language difference, which would include this idea of processing that we just did. So what's your perception? Is the target language transparent as the native language? Are you viewing the world? Can you view the world in the same way? For that, we can go back to this idea of language neutral items. Why are you laughing at me every time I talk about this?
It's not bad.
Oh, okay, okay. I was wondering if it's because Mark and I actually did these. Mark and I did these tapes with Language Neutral.
I was actually wondering if it sounds rude to speakers of Indian English when we use contrastive stress in a way that we don't. That's kind of why I was laughing.
Oh, because of the odd flip?
Yeah, because there's a guy who doesn't work at the radio station anymore, but there was, we had this student who was a master's student in the computer science program.
Yeah.
He was from Hyderabad.
Ah.
And he, native Indian English speaker. Just one, the reason I was laughing, I was wondering if I like ever unintentionally sounded harsh to him.
And you may have done.
By using contrastive stress when I was talking to him.
Yeah, you may have done.
Yeah.
You may well have done. Yeah, because we do know that the way that stress is indicated in Indian English and American English is completely different. So in Indian English, it's volume, and in American English, it's volume and height. And you know all this. Mark and I did all my tapes for my book, which is why I thought you were laughing.
I was laughing not about that, but about
about the possibility.
Like being old man to this Indian stuff.
Yeah. You could have been. Yeah, because your pitch would have been really high for him.
Right.
For him, that would have been a really high pitch, a contrastive stress pitch. So yeah. Now it's interesting because we know a lot about the other way because of the power differential, right? We know way more about what American and British people think of Indian English speakers, African English speakers, and whatever, because that's the way the power goes. We don't know anywhere near as much about how Indian people perceive our uses or African English speakers perceive our uses of these things. Yeah. Which has nothing to do with linguistics and everything to do with socio-political power. But I digress. And then lastly, obviously all this transfer is mediated by the learner's actual knowledge of the target language. So some learners, move through these stages quicker because they have a better knowledge of the target language. And obviously, the more you know about the target language, the more it mediates between the transfer on any of these different levels. Okay, and that's all I had for today. So your reading post this week is a discussion post, and Shihun has put in discussion threads for both sections. And I want you to go back to the time to think boxes on page 140 and 141. Think about your own experience in learning. Oh God, all these errors in learning an L2 or an L3 or even LX, which means as many additional languages as you might have, and respond to one of the two question boxes. Okay. I'm assuming everybody's had a crack at learning one second language. If there's anyone out there that hasn't, that's okay. Don't feel bad. Just maybe pick something that you've gotten from your learners instead. But I think all of us, more or less successfully, have had a crack at a second language, right? All right. So let's go back and check the summary on page 155, because a lot of this stuff is new, right? These sort of, and this is going to come back in your midterm. So I want us to make sure we've got a general idea. So if we go back to page 155, the idea of transfer or interference became less associated with behaviorism. They began to realize that learners could have cross-linguistic influences, but still be actively creating their own language, right? So this is where you get this intersection between creative construction and some of these things that we looked at today. L1 to L2 difference can predict the amount of avoidance, right? L1 to L2 similarities can result in differential learning rates, learning paths, overproduction of certain forms. Saliency of a form in the L2 may lead it to be learned more quickly, regardless of whether it is present in the L1 or not. Our example for that was Sheehan's "What's up?" Not much. There are various ways in saliency that can be defined, but one of the most important is frequency. How often you hear this thing, okay? If you hear it a lot, it becomes more salient. Similarities between the L1 and the L2, rather than being the easiest things, may prove to be the most difficult if there are subtle distinctions between the two languages. Semantic and conceptual facts about the L1 can affect a learner's choice of forms in the L2. For example, French learners of English tend to overuse the present perfect in English for past events because of the existence of the passé composé in French. Okay, so in their mind, that's what we mean by the semantic, the way the world works, right? In their mind, that should be the tense that you use because that's the way the world works, right? Recent research into learners' processing of language has shown that L1 can affect how L2 process. And more recent research into morpheme order studies has shown that not all learners follow the order. So remember, this is the morpheme order studies that we looked at. The L1 learner appears to make, the L1 of the learner appears to make a difference in the order of the morpheme acquisition. So think about it in terms of strong claims and weak claims. The morpheme order studies that you looked at last week with the BSM, with the cartoon houses and whatever, made a very strong claim. They claimed that regardless of first language, and regardless if you were a kid learning a second language or an adult learning a second language, you learned morphemes in basically the same order. You learned the 8 inflectional morphemes in the same order, right? You remember that? And that was called the natural order hypothesis. Well, more that's been done on that suggests that that strong claim is too strong, okay? And that a weaker claim that suggests that you're likely to learn them in the same order, but there might be differential paths and differential rates, looks a lot more likely. Questions, comments? Diego.
Why do you think that is on that last part?
Why do I think which part?
That the morpheme order does seem to happen in the general order.
Well, so this is interesting. It's a good question. If you believe that, so you're going to look at this in the next chapter, right? The question would be, either you're learning your second language in the same way you're learning your first language. No, what did you ask me? Different order or same order?
Why do you think that there is a same order?
Oh, same order, right. That would be the people that really go for that, the people that think that this machinery inside your head is ongoing. So if you leave someone alone, the machinery will just kick into gear again. Hence Krashen-esque kinds of reading approach kind of things. Don't, leave them be, let them go in a certain order. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of that. And I think that there may be a gazillion other reasons why you might find similar orders for things. And I think one of them is very probably frequency. So, but these are empirical questions that I haven't investigated, but other people have. That, now we've got corpora, right? Now we've got now we've got corpora of millions and millions of words, you can actually look at these things and see. And so it becomes an empirical question. But I never bought the we're all learning it the same way thing after puberty. But other people do. So, for one of your data analysis, you're going to look at exactly that. Yeah, to see what you think about that idea. Because, for example, if you believe that there's a certain order in which things are learned, and there's a reason why, which you'll have a look at next week, you should be able to predict if you teach someone one thing, they'll learn another thing. We'll talk about it next week. But anyway, I'm not a big fan of that.
Actually, I mentioned that in my responses for last week.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with it either.
Oh, really? And why don't you agree with it?
Oh, I agree with it for infants, for language 1, because I think the answer comes down to the mental capacity of the children. They're not going to understand what a past perfect conditional is. So they have to start with the simplest forms of the language and progress to the more complex. But as an adult, you focus on what's important, not what is the easiest.
So what you're saying is, as an adult, you might be more concerned with perceptual salience, right? Which is exactly one of the things we talked about here, right? That perceptual salience is potentially more important. Now, what you need to understand is that these ideas that we looked at in this chapter, and we've looked back at coreness, predictability, frequency, this is all new. This is all pretty new, right? This is from the sort of 1990s onwards. So this is after Krashen. Krashen was like, well, it's fine. It's a natural order. If you leave the learner alone, they'll acquire it. They won't learn it. Then they'll be able to produce it, and everything will be hunky-dory. And this stuff was like, okay, this is not happening, you know, and I don't believe you if you tell me it's not happening because there's like a monitor or something, or an affective, you know, I don't believe you. You can't prove that, and I don't believe you. So these are other ways in which we can look at the possibilities. But you can take any one of these ways and make it your life's work, right? So you can say, I'm going to spend my whole time looking at universal processing strategies, and then you can have your you know, or like Nicholas and other people have spent their career looking at frequency effects. You know, I mean, you can take one of these things and just have at it. I've spent my entire career looking at things like contrastive stress. So, you know, we need all of us to kind of do our little bits and then smudge it all together. And it's pretty new to be smudged together at this point. So, yeah.
I was frustrated when I was in Mexico, and I had all these people who were sort of unconsciously channeling, crashing around me, telling me that, oh, to pick up Spanish, all you got to do is just get out there and listen to everybody talking. I'm just like, I can understand what the hell they're saying. I mean, they're speaking in this Yucatan accent, just like really, really fast, and they don't say the ends of the words. So it's like in Texas Spanish, I can pick out most things.
Right.
But they're speaking Caribbean Spanish, and it was like, I could listen to them for centuries.
Right.
And not progress.
Right.
At all, because I don't know what they're saying.
So this is a classic, the reason that foreign language programs, when they say, oh, send your kid on a foreign language thing, is, you know, just sending your kid on a foreign language thing is not a great plan, because what we know is that if they just literally hang around, they might not get any further than basic phrases. So you'd be able to say, you know, it's like me in Hungary. I could say, you know, I want this and this, pay, thank you very much, you know,
Right.
no problem. If I had a glass of wine, I could say a few other things, but I was never like great at it. And so what they say now is, what you should have done, for example, what the advice they would give you now, first of all, they would say your instincts were absolutely right. Of course, it wasn't just gonna like blossom in your brain. What they would say is you need to do both. You need to go into classes and you need to do it on the outside as well. So most good foreign language placement programs now make the students do both. So you actually are in class and you're learning stuff and you're able to break down stuff that you couldn't do in the real, and then you go out and you become surrounded by it also. So your instincts were absolutely right. In my view, I mean, but I've never picked up a language. I mean, language for me is not a second language learning. Foreign language learning was, you know, Chinese I gave up. I just couldn't. I did one semester of Chinese and then I was about to shoot myself. So I was like, no, I can't do this anymore. You know, yeah, was too. Now, interestingly, I do have some sort of, I think there might be something to this age thing. I'm not quite sure how it works, but the only language that I picked up like that was French, that I started learning when I was 11. By the time I was 16, you know, I was, but of course, as an adult, I no longer speak French. And so I have what's called language attrition, which means that over the years, my French has gotten, you know, now when Sal's mom comes, who speaks French because she's from Belgium, I can understand her, but I can't respond to her in French. So that's the other issue. You know, you can learn a second language. I learned French way better than I learned German or Hungarian, but now my French is really barely more usable than the others because I've had so much language attrition. So, you know, it's sort of use it or lose it. But it also might have been that when I was 11, I had a lot less to do. You know, I could focus on learning French. And by the time I got to Hungary, I was teaching and I was, you know, I had to find my rent, you know, I had a whole lot of other things to do in addition to learning Hungarian, right? So, yeah.
And it's the wrong family.
Say that again?
And it's the wrong family. It's not Germanic or Romance. So
yeah, no, Hungarian was a special baby. Yeah. And then I think I started swapping horse riding lessons for Hungarian lessons, and no, horse riding lessons for English lessons. So I'd teach him English and he'd teach me horse riding. And then it got to a point where he was like shouting at me in Hungarian and I couldn't understand what the hell was going on. And I couldn't do anything with the horse because I didn't know what it was telling me to do with the horse. And I got really depressed and I just, you know.
You should have taught him English for equestrian purposes.
Yeah, it was interesting that I now realize as an adult, I should have said, you need to use English because I'm teaching you English. But instead I was listening to him screaming at me in Hungarian going, I don't know what to do. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. You have a good spring break. Look out for the email I'm going to send you saying that the data analysis information is up and we'll talk about it on the 20th. Okay. Thanks, everyone.